In the last couple of years, Slowdive has slowly turned into one of the biggest and most iconic bands in shoegaze history. Despite the band releasing 3 albums in the 90s, the commercial peak of their career would only come after 30 years, and it happened because of one app that we all know about: TikTok. So come with me as I dive deeper into what happened with the band 30 years ago, and how TikTok helped save their career. Make sure to subscribe if you also gaze at your shoes, and enjoy. This is the history of Slowdive, the cruelty of 90s music critics towards them, and their newfound internet success. Slowdive formed in October of '89 by Neil Halstead and Rachel Goswell. The two were friends together since the age of 6, and before forming Slowdive, they were in a band called the Pumpkin Fairies. The Pumpkin Fairies was actually an indie band which was formed at the Sunday Youth Group when Rachel and Neil were just 15. Neil was really big into indie music at the time, while Rachel was in her goth era. So the two bonded over the one band that both goths and indie fans love, the one and only The Smiths, and also the Velvet Underground. After 3 years and a couple different bands here and there, in 1989 Nick Chaplin joined the group and named Rachel's and Neil's newly formed band Slowdive. The band got its name from a dream Nick had after Rachel showed him the song Slowdive by Susie and the Banshees. Even though at first they didn't sound too good, later down the road they started getting inspired by this one shoegaze band that was going around at the time. This band, of course, being My Bloody Valentine. The band would start experimenting more with guitar tunings and pedals, and with Christian Saville joining the band, they finally started finding their own sound. They recorded their first demo, and they started playing at the After nightclub in Reading as support acts. It wouldn't take long for people to take notice of them, because quickly after those shows, they got a call from Creation Records. Yes, the Creation Records that managed Oasis in the 90s. Did you see they're back together, by the way? I made a video about them 4 months before reuniting. Since I'm doing a shameless plug anyways, I wanted to let you guys know that I've recently made a Discord server. You can talk to people there, and also I will be discussing future video topics with the members every week. I'll share with you guys the videos I've planned, and if there's anyone who wants to add to that discussion, any fun facts you want to share for, let's say, a band or a movie I'm talking about, you can do that there and you will be credited in the videos. Also, there's private channels for Patreon members where I'll share part of my videos before they're public. Check them both out in the link down below if you're interested. Thank you very much. Anyways, back to Creation Records and this little ginger guy called Alan McGee. Alan McGee made a name for himself after discovering the iconic shoegaze band Jesus and the Mary Chain. But he wouldn't just stop there. Creation Records also managed Primal Scream, My Bloody Valentine, and Ride. They just owned shoegaze, it was crazy. So this call from Alan McGee was a big fucking deal for the band. They basically made it, and they were all a bunch of 18-19-year-old kids. It was unreal for them to even speak to this guy. Nonetheless, McGee signed them on the spot after calling them fucking ethereal.
I looked out the window after they went away and they'd got signed, and you know how the little kids jump on each other in the back and they tussle each other? They were doing that. They were like punching each other as they were walking down the road and jumping in each other's back, and I was like, God, I really have signed children this time, you know?
On the 5th of November 1990, the band released their self-titled EP, Slowdive, and it was met to absolutely amazing critical acclaim. The critics were starting to count them in with all the great shoegaze bands of that era. It seemed like they truly believed in them. Slowdive is the next big thing, you got this guys. Their single Catch the Breeze even managed to hit #1 on the UK indie charts. So the band had a pretty good start with their career, and they immediately went to the studio to start working on their debut album. After 6 weeks and a whole lot of weed, they ended up with a kind of half-finished album, which would bite them in the ass later. Nonetheless, on the 2nd of September 1991, Slowdive released their debut album, Just for a Day. Now this debut did not go nearly as well as their critically acclaimed EP. In fact, most of the critics hated it, and there were 2 main reasons for this. One, this album was rushed into completion because the band felt like they were running out of time and missing their big moment. This didn't matter as much though, because it still ended up being a decent record. Now the second reason why the critics hated it was because grunge had just started to go mainstream. And this was only one of the 2 absolutely huge guitar-based genres of that decade. The band had no idea what was about to come. Back in the 90s, NME and all these music magazines were seen as a judge of good music. If a band was on their cover, that's how you knew they were good. Of course, since then people realized that they were just going along with whatever genre they thought was gonna be big. But in the 90s, whatever the greasy critics of NME said about you actually mattered. And let's just say, they were starting to suddenly get really sick of shoegaze. Coincidentally, as soon as grunge was getting big, suddenly they all realized that shoegaze doesn't even sound that good. What? I never listened to shoegaze. I was always a fan of fast American guitars, what are you on about? Of course, they would later change their opinion again after Britpop would go mainstream, but none of this really mattered because NME and all the other music magazines fucking hated Slowdive now. It was a major fucking letdown, said Melody Maker. They went on a tour in 91 in the UK, they also went and toured the US with Blur. As we all know, this tour actually ended up switching Blur into a Britpop band, but Slowdive would remain as shoegaze as ever. The band was at a low point mentally because of all the nasty reviews. I mean, they were literal kids, and their dreams were being crushed right in front of them. At the time, Rachel and Neil also broke up, so the whole thing was taking a toll on all of them. The sadness, however, would all be channeled into the production of their second album, Souvlaki. With Britpop slowly starting to appear into the scene, Creation Records was getting more and more frustrated with Slowdive. It got to the point where Alan McGee rejected over 25 songs, and at the end of it, he just gave up and let them do whatever they wanted to do. Neil Halstead went into a cottage in North Wales for about 2 weeks to write some new material, and he came back with a new sound for the band. With songs like 40 Days and Dagger, the band finally had an idea of where to go with their next album. Souvlaki was starting to build itself. And right after those early songs, Neil presented to the band their definitive masterpiece, When the Sun Hits. After most of the songs were finally written, there was only one thing left to do: production. They needed someone to make the songs stand out from one another, and in a way make them more radio friendly. Not just for sales, but to make it more clear to the listeners as well. And the man for this job was Ed Buller. The album was finally starting to sound good, but Slowdive had one more trick up their sleeves. This trick being the king of ambient music, the one and only Brian Eno. Despite refusing to be their producer, Eno did accept to co-write some songs with the band. The band got really excited, and by this collaboration we got Here She Comes and Sing. I used Sing on my post-apocalyptic short movie for my school, so that's how you know it's good, you know? Look at this beautiful shot. Okay, I don't want to get too much into the production of the album because it gets a little bit confusing for people who aren't into that stuff, but the last song I want to talk about from this album is Souvlaki's Space Station. I think both Sing and Souvlaki Space Station don't get talked about nearly enough because these songs are just beautiful. Souvlaki Space Station really does put you on another planet. I can't even remember the amount of nights I've listened to this song at 3 AM staring at the ceiling. It's just incredible. Just like 40 Days, the song was pretty much written because of Neil's and Rachel's relationship. Just this time, it was from Rachel's POV. Anyways, with these songs written and recorded, it was finally time for Souvlaki to be released to the world. Now, this album was a clear improvement from their debut. Songs like When the Sun Hits, 40 Days and Allison couldn't possibly go unnoticed, even if grunge and Britpop was a hit at the time, right? Wrong! It was the same story all over again, just even worse this time. It was 1993, so Britpop was already getting pretty big. Grunge was as big as ever, so there was no need for shoegaze in the eyes of music journalists. This music was outdated and terrible. It didn't matter if you made a beautiful album. If it was shoegaze, it was unacceptable. This record is a soulless void. I would rather drown choking on a bath full of porridge than ever listen to it again, said Dave Simpson from Melody Maker. This album got number 50 on the UK charts, doing much worse than their debut, and it was just devastating for the band. They had worked for a whole year on this record, scrapping and recording and re-recording a whole lot of songs. And in the end, nobody managed to appreciate it in the slightest. It was too late for Slowdive. Logically, the band felt terrible. They felt like maybe they just weren't cut off for this industry. The end was coming very soon. After the really disappointing release of Souvlaki, McGee had also found the band that was gonna get Creation Records into Britpop, Oasis. After starting to work with Oasis, none of these other shoegaze bands really mattered. Shoegaze was over. Slowdive did make one more record under Creation called Pygmalion, which was a more ambient inspired record. It didn't really matter though, because that type of music was never gonna sell in the middle of a very laddish 90s Britain. 2 weeks after the release of Pygmalion, Slowdive was dropped by Creation. At this point of their career, bands either usually get into a huge fight with each other and reunite 15 years later, or they slowly fade out of the mainstream. Slowdive did not bind to these rules. In 2014, Slowdive got back together for the Primavera Sound Festival in Barcelona. Now this reunion wasn't just some cheap attempt at profiting on nostalgia, because let's be honest, there wouldn't really be a big market for that. Shoegaze never got nearly as big as grunge or Britpop, and a Slowdive reunion was not gonna make the same buzz as an Oasis reunion. What the band quickly noticed though, is that these shows were being attended by a much younger audience, people that weren't even born when Souvlaki dropped. They were just a bunch of teenagers who had found the band through the internet and had fallen in love with them. Yes, it did take 20 whole years, but people were finally starting to notice the genius of Slowdive. These reunion shows were going better than any of their gigs back in the 90s when they were being managed by the cool hip label of Alan McGee. The band did a world tour, which also went way better than their American tour in 91, and in 2017 they announced their first single in 22 years, Star Roving. Star Roving was pretty much loved by everyone immediately, and it even got the band trending on Twitter after they had slowly started getting bigger online during the last 3 years. Now, did the critics like it? Well, of course they did now. They didn't have a reason for hating the band anymore. 5 months later, Slowdive released their self-titled album, Slowdive. Slowdive quickly became the band's biggest album commercially. The band had finally proved everyone wrong, after 20 long years under the shadows. They hadn't just proved the critics wrong about their past albums, but they had also proved that this wasn't just some reunion band. Slowdive is back, and they're better than ever. This time, they're actually being appreciated. The album peaked at number 16 on the UK charts. The band was showing a more mature and thought out version of their sound. The success of this album also made a lot of teenagers go back and listen to their 90s records, and of course, they loved it. This was only the start. 3 years after their comeback album, the world would go into quarantine because of COVID. This meant two things. One, TikTok was bigger than ever, with everyone having to stay inside glued to their phones. And two, because of the nature of everything that was going on, teenagers on TikTok were starting to get more into shoegaze. Of course, the pandemic wasn't the only reason why shoegaze blew up like that, because it had been growing online for years. It felt like the stars were just perfectly aligned for Slowdive, and then randomly, they blew up. When the Sun Hits suddenly started to get big on TikTok without the band even doing anything. Around that time, My Bloody Valentine also started to trend, and after 30 years of what seemed as a failed genre, shoegaze was bigger than ever. 142,000 TikTok videos using a 30-year-old song that hadn't even charted when it got released.
Is it time for the TikTok song? Yes, it's time for the bloody TikTok song. I hate that's what you know it as. Oh, you heard it somewhere else, I suppose? I heard it from a friend. And where did they first hear it? That's not important.
They were starting to get recognized as one of the most iconic bands of the shoegaze era. Even Nick Chaplin's 12-year-old daughter knew about them. It was crazy.
I've got a 12-year-old daughter who doesn't discover music in the same way that I did. She discovers music on stuff like TikTok. Suddenly she was aware that her friends at school knew all about Slowdive and knew the songs, especially stuff like Allison and When the Sun Hits, which seemed to be being used by lots of people in different ways for different things. And none of them knew that her dad played in the band, and she wasn't aware that, you know, her dad's band had this reach amongst her. So once she worked that out, suddenly what I did for a living became much more interesting. Like before that, she was like, oh, you're just playing some shitty band. And none of that has been done by us. We've not done, the label hasn't done it, we haven't done it, our PR people haven't done it, it's organic.
Slowly but surely, Slowdive had made it into the mainstream, and it was all out of nowhere thanks to TikTok and some very depressed teens. What happened with Slowdive is probably one of my favorite internet comeback stories, along with like Panchico. In 2023, after the sudden internet success, the band released their 5th album, Everything Is Alive. The album became the band's most successful album chart-wise, peaking at number 6 in the UK and getting top 10 in Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands and New Zealand. So yeah, after a bizarre feud with some critics in the 90s, which resulted into the end of their career, Slowdive came back swinging harder than ever, and it all worked out in the end, thanks to TikTok. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I am thinking of covering more shoegaze bands in the future, but who knows. Let me know in the comments any other genres or topics you want me to talk about, and subscribe. Check out my Patreon and watch my other videos if you like this one. Love you, blah blah blah.